Today I want to talk about all of the books that I read in 2024. This is any book that I've finished reading, and I'm going to rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. To keep this from being too long, I'm not going to talk about the synopsis really of any of these. I'm just going to tell you them in order and my overall what I thought of them. I am, however, going to do graphic novels separately from novels. So I'm going to start with the graphic novels and then I'll go through the novels because I just had too hard a time deciding where graphic novels would fall amongst the novels. So it was a lot easier for me to compare them by separating the two. So starting with graphic novels, with the least favorite one that I read, these are all by series, not by specific volumes. But at the bottom is The Umbrella Academy by Gerard Way. I just didn't really love the way that this was written. The style of both writing and art I felt like made for kind of a confusing story, and I just never got super invested in anything that was going on throughout this, and that is why this was my least favorite graphic novel series that I read this year. I still think it's a cool idea, but it just really did not work for me style-wise. The next graphic novel series is Rat Queens, which I read volumes 7 and 8, and those were written by Ryan Ferrier, who is not the original writer. He only wrote volumes 7 and 8, and I think that's what I didn't really like about it. There were also a few different artists throughout these two volumes, and that was something that I didn't really love seeing. I think the styles were a little too different. Overall, I really like this series, but just looking at volumes 7 and 8, which is what I read in 2024, these were pretty low on the graphic novels that I read. Next up is Dryad, volumes 1 and 2, which this is the original writer of Rat Queens, Curtis J. Weeb. There's a lot of cool things in this, but it never really got finished, and it kind of ends on a pretty big cliffhanger. So I liked the setup of this, but it really did feel like a lot of setup, and then it just sort of ended, which is why it wasn't that great, because even within the volumes, it didn't feel like a complete story. It really felt like the beginning of something that I'm assuming at this point is never getting a conclusion. Next up, I have The Last Delivery by Evan Dom. This is a pretty weird, pretty dark story about a courier trying to deliver a package at this crazy party. There's all sorts of weird, dangerous things happening. People are dying just as part of the party games. So this was a lot darker than I expected it to be, but I generally enjoyed it. It is a complete self-contained graphic novel. It's not like a series or anything, which this is actually the only non-series graphic novel I read this year. Then I read volumes 1 through 3 of the Dragon Age graphic novels by David Gaider. I really like the Dragon Age video games. They're some of my favorite video games, but I just didn't feel like it really captured the same feeling as the video games. Obviously, it's not a video game, but even just reading like the banter between the characters and their dynamics with one another, with things that were going on, I just didn't find as engaging. Having really liked the games didn't really translate into really liking the graphic novels. I just wanted to finally give them a try, and I did, and they were good, but I didn't love them. Next, as my second favorite graphic novel series that I read this year, is Giant Days. I read volumes 9 through 14. This is by John Allison. I had read the first half of this series, I don't even know how long ago, and I finally finished it, and it's just so charming. It's very funny and goofy, but it's also very endearing, the way that the characters connect with one another, the things that they're going through. I think it's a very engaging story to just follow along with these girls. Kind of cozy, charming, and also just a general fun read. And my favorite graphic novel series I read last year was Ascender by Jeff Lemire. This is the sequel series to Descender, which I had read years ago and really liked. And I also really liked this. I love the art style of this. I think it's very unique, but also very easy to understand what's going on page, which I think is pretty important with a graphic novel, to be able to follow along panel to panel, not just with the written narrative and dialogue, but just with visually what you're seeing. I think the story is really cool. The world is pretty big. It's a sci-fi, so we see a good amount of the world. There's a good amount of characters, but I feel like it was pretty easy to keep track of everyone and everything going on. So those are all of the graphic novels I read last year. But now let's move into novels. I have 18 in total that I finished last year, which doesn't really feel like a lot, but I think that's a pretty decent amount. I'm happy with it anyway. So starting at the bottom, number 18, Where Late the Sweetbird Sang by Kate Wilhelm. I liked the theme of this book, but I didn't really like how long it took for me to care about anything. It just felt like a lot of backstory and leading up to the present day, but I didn't feel very invested in anything until at least halfway through the book. I get why people might like this, but I clearly did not, because it was my least favorite novel of last year. In a similar vein, my next book is Double Star by Robert A. Heinlein. I again liked the theme of this, but the general story was just okay. I didn't like the main character, but I thought that the actual plot of seeing him starting off as just an ordinary actor, being asked to play the role of this politician and pretend to be him in a very convincing way, and seeing how that affects the world and also himself, his own personality changes throughout the story. And I think that on its own is very interesting. Next, I have The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov. This one was really disappointing to me because I really loved the first part of this book. The second section of the book dragged on so long and in such detail about this alien race, which is something I find a lot in older sci-fi, and it's not something that I care about. It's too much detail for very little consequence within the story, in my opinion. So, generally good story. Loved the beginning. Didn't love the middle at all. And by the end, I was just not really caring about anything that was happening. Next, I have A Feather So Black by Lyra Celine. Me not liking this may be my own fault. I didn't realize that this was an adult fantasy romance, and that was a mistake on my part. By the time I realized it, I considered just not reading the book. I really like the plot of this. I still stand by, I don't like romance. There's such a heavy focus on the romantic relationships within the story, and I really didn't like reading about those. I didn't care. I didn't want the details of what was going on between them, but I did really like the actual plot, which is what kept me reading. So if this had been a different genre, I probably would have loved it, which is ridiculous to say. Next, I have Good Girls Don't Die by Christina Henry. This is a thriller following 3 different women, and I had a good time reading each of the 3 women individually. And then once we got to the end and the big reveal of how everything tied together, why they were actually in the situations that we found them in, I just really didn't like the ending at all. I didn't like the big reveal. It just felt ridiculous to me. And I think with a thriller, the reveal at the end is kind of a big deal. Next, I have A Violet Made of Thorns by Gina Chen. This is a young adult fantasy. I liked the plot of this. I liked following a sort of unreliable seer character. I mostly liked the whole prince dynamic, but I just felt like the characters were so immature. They're supposed to be, I think they're 19 and 20, and they're in these pretty central roles within their kingdom. So the way that they behave publicly with one another was so ridiculous to me. They had like some good banter together, but mostly it's like privately they have a good dynamic that I was interested in, and then publicly they're just behaving like petty children. It was not a thing I was interested in or felt like made any sense given their ages and their roles. Next, I have Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is a generally very interesting story, seeing this man who has a very low IQ and has his entire life, he's never known anything else, have this procedure that successfully gives him a crazy high IQ, and he suddenly understands so much about the world and the nuances of his interactions with people and the relationships around him and all of that, and then seeing how that changes not only his worldview but himself. I think the plot of this was really good. I did like the writing, but I felt like there were scenes in it that didn't really need to be there. Then I have The Dead Cattail Assassins by P. Djeli Clark. I thought I would have liked this more than I did. I didn't really love what the twist was. I feel like it should have been more interesting than it was. I don't know what about it didn't really click for me, but once I got to that point, I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm really gonna like this. And I generally liked it. I didn't love the writing style. I think that was the main thing for me. I don't know, there's just something about it where I wanted to know what happened, but I also didn't really care about the characters. Next, I have The Hexologist by Josiah Bancroft. I had heard wonderful things about this. I really enjoyed reading this. I liked the writing. I liked the world. I generally had fun reading this. I could not tell you a single thing about it at this point. It was not memorable at all. I remember the setup and I remember having fun reading it, kind of exploring this world with these characters as they're trying to figure out what is making the king behave the way that he's behaving and trying to solve that mystery. But just generally following along with the details of the plot and how everything led into everything else. I don't feel like I really absorbed any of it. Feels weird to put it this high up for a book that I don't think is memorable at all for me. Next up, I have A House Like an Accordion by Audrey Burgess. I feel like some of the choices the main character made didn't really make sense to me. Like, I don't get why she needed to buy all of the places that she was finding when really the goal was just to follow through them to find her father. There's like an almost love triangle that felt very obvious but also very unnecessary, but I did like the way that everything played out in the end. I don't know, I really enjoyed reading this. I liked going along on this and figuring out this very interesting magic in this world. I feel like there were a lot of things I could have guessed, but I still had a good time getting to them. Next, I have The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, which was actually kind of disappointing. So again, this is another one that feels kind of weird to put this high up, but I did still really like this. It wasn't the story I expected to get, but I still really enjoyed the story that I did get. I liked the little girl as the main character and following her specifically and seeing how everyone kind of comes to terms with that as they all work together trying to get somewhere safe. And I think I just expected more interaction with the world, I guess, more like environmental factors, and they do have encounters with people outside of their group, but I feel like that was really not central to what was going on. It was very much about the characters and their relationships with one another. Next, I have The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. This was another book that I feel like I didn't love quite as much as I expected to, but I think I went into it expecting there to be a greater sense of magic in the world as a historical fantasy. It's very tied to a particular character within the story. However, I did really love seeing the brother and sister's individual journeys as they are coping with the traumas of war and the things that they've seen and the things that have happened to them, and also seeing their relationship with one another I really loved. So similarly, not quite what I was expecting, but I did really love the story that I ended up getting. Then I have The Butcher of the Forest by Primi Mohammed. This I really liked. The writing of it, it's a fairly short story, but I feel like it really captured that fairy tale feeling of going into this dark forest with this woman, trying to find these children and trying to hopefully survive and make it home. I feel like the reveal of her background was probably the least impactful thing, which I feel like it should have had a much larger impact than it did. But I really loved just going on this journey with her. I felt very engaged and it was just very compelling the way that it was written. I wanted to keep going and find out what was going to happen to her. And I also really liked the ending where it felt very conclusive, but it also felt like there could be more. Next, we're in my top 5. I already talked about my best books of the year, so if you saw that video, you probably know what these are already. But my number 5 is The Truth of the Aleke by Moses Osiotomi. I just really love the writing of it. I feel like the world feels very complete. The characters feel very well developed in going on these personal growth journeys with them throughout the story. And I feel like we have just enough information for it to feel very engaging and very compelling. And I think that's something that I tend to have the hardest time with in novellas, feeling like these are full characters and this is a complete world. I think that's very difficult to do in a fantasy setting, to really paint this full picture in as few words as possible. And I feel like it's done very well in these books. At number 4, I have A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. I didn't really know anything about this going into it other than it was a T. Kingfisher fantasy, and I've read a bunch of her fantasy already and I've liked all of them. So that was kind of enough for me. Our main character, the younger of the main characters, is definitely dealing with some very difficult things at home, with her mother being this murderous sorceress, and also having our older main character, the sister of the squire that the sorceress is now pursuing, recognizing that this girl needs help and seeing them come together in their personal growth throughout it, but also just the weird magic and things that happen along the way. I just thought this story was just the right balance of being kind of comforting, but also tackling some heavier, darker things. At number 3, I have Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. This is the sequel to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. I didn't expect to really like that book when I read it, or at least not as much as I ended up liking it. But I feel like the second book was even better than the first book. We already know the character, we already know a bit about this world, and I feel like we really got to get right into things. There's more side characters traveling with Emily. So we see more of her growth as a character, more of her research, more Fae antics. It starts pretty much right at the beginning. I feel like in the first book there was a little more setup of establishing who Emily is and what she's doing, and in this book we already know that, obviously, so we kind of get right into the plot. This just took all of the things that I liked about the first book, and they're just more of them, and they're done even better. At number 2, I have The Slain Divine by David Dalglish. This is the conclusion to the Vagrant Gods trilogy, and I've really loved the series. I thought this was a great conclusion. There was a lot of action. All of the characters are going through their own personal story arcs, as well as the overarching trying to take back their island nation. I think it was very well paced. I loved the characters. They all have very different personalities and dynamics with one another. I love the magic system being based around gods and faith, and the sort of give and take of that between the people and the gods, and how much power they have and how much they give back to their believers. And I generally just had a lot of fun with this series. I think there's so much going on, but it's all so well paced and makes sense within everything else that's going on. So definitely enjoyed the series. And my favorite book of the year is Le Fay by Sophie Keach, the sequel to Morgan Is My Name. I love this series. I love the writing of it. I love Arthurian legend. I love the character of Morgan, and I particularly love this version of Morgan that we get. I like that the story is entirely centered around her and her life, and as much as we see other familiar characters, we only really know about them what Morgan knows about them. And I also like that she's not like a perfectly good character. I feel like I'm rooting for her as the main character, as we're inside of her head. I really care about this character, but I also feel like she still makes mistakes along the way. I really like that. I think it makes character much more dynamic and believable. And although this is a familiar character and familiar plot points, I'm still so engrossed in this world when I'm reading this story. And I'm definitely looking forward to the final book in this. So that is every book that I finished reading ranked in 2024. Let me know what you thought of any of these books, if you agree or disagree with my rankings of any of them, or just let me know what your favorite book that you read last year was. I would love to hear about that. Otherwise, that's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.